Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about screen time, social media, and ADHD, the messy connections among them. So I'll be talking for about 20 minutes, and I'll be open for questions and answers at the end of this time. So as usual, I'll start with the take-home message, and the take-home message is that although most, not absolutely every, but most studies find a moderate connection, moderate to strong association between ADHD and excessive or problematic social media use, it's unclear how strong the causality goes in either direction. So the take home would be there's some evidence that ADHD does predispose or drive people to develop excessive social media use and problematic social media use. And there's also some evidence that social media use when taken to extremes, and it's particularly problematic more than just the amount excessive, can drive ADHD symptoms. There's some debate as to whether it is just increasing symptoms of impulsivity and attention hyperactivity, or whether it's truly generating or pushing more people who are subsynodal into full ADHD criteria category. And clearly, there may well be a host of confounding factors that drive both social media use to be excessive and ADHD in individuals. So the final piece of the take-home message is that given the strong connection and some limited evidence that restricting your use may be helpful for your mental state, it's a good idea to be monitoring and be aware of what your use is. And if it feels that it is excessive, interfering with other activities, and particularly interfering with sleep, then it's probably a good idea to work on strategies to curtail it, which I will get into. So to launch into it, the big areas of problems, this is a really messy area. I had hoped 2 weeks ago to sort of discreetly talk about video gaming and ADHD connection, and this time more social media and ADHD connection. And there is a big blurring between studies that are looking at screen time, which in America of today, the average teenager is spending something like 7 to 8 hours connected, attending to their screens, most of which, or the biggest chunk of which, is social media on a statistical basis. But whether they're counting screen time, which is all social media and gaming and television watching, or whether they're trying to focus just on social media interactions. So sorting out what's actually being measured, whether it's being measured by actually recording or monitoring what person's tuned into or logged onto, or whether it's their assessment and whether they're assessing it on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis, or they're just giving a summary at the end of day, week, or month, or something like that. So there's a lot of variability and a lot of blurring here. Second big issue that I found trying to dissect the literature is defining what is excessive social media use and or problematic. So excessive can be defined more simply, again, separate from what I just said before about how you're counting or what you're counting in terms of social media use and other screen time use. So excessive is usually just a measure of how much time, and if you fall into the top 10 percentile or quarter percentile, you can define excessive how you want on absolute objective cutoffs there. The more difficult category is how do you define problematic social media use. So some of the problematic social media use studies are using a model fairly similar to what we talked about 2 weeks ago with the problematic addictive gaming behavior, online gaming. So some of them are using those addiction-based criteria, whether you're doing it to an excessive extent and that it's interfering with other social work or other obligations, whether you've tried to cut back and were unable to, whether you crave it when you're not doing it. So the whole host of behavioral addictive symptoms can be used as one set of measures for measuring excessive or problematic social media use. But other researchers will define problematic use differently. So we know that there's a whole host of behaviors that are a problem online, as many of them are on the real world, and that people with ADHD are running into these problems both online and in the real world more commonly than non-ADHD peers. So things like bullying others, being the victim as a victim of bullying, sexting, doing other risky or inappropriate things online. There's studies looking at people with ADHD tweeting, or I don't know what it's Xing right now. I'm not sure what it's called. But clearly people with ADHD in several studies are not just sending more messages from more different accounts. There's more swearing, more profanity, more candor or more bluntness in saying things that maybe aren't wise in retrospect to say, and more communicating messages at hours late at night, which indicates they're not probably getting good sleep as well. So again, very different measures and different studies as to what is problematic social media use. And then the third big issue is that some studies use just does a person meet full criteria for ADHD, yes or no? And others are using ADHD rating scales to measure a symptomatology of impulsivity, inattentive, hyperactivity. And if you're using a collection of symptoms, then it's easier to tell, is this getting worse or better, rather than if you just have an absolute cutoff. The critics say that the problem with the symptom-based approach is that you may be, again, just looking at behaviors rather than someone who really truly has ADHD. The problem with the ADHD cutoff is you may be missing so much potential information, and someone may be changing substantially in terms of the degree or severity of their ADHD, and yet you may only have do they have it or do they not check mark. So I'm going to oversimplify, overcondense, but the studies suggest that if we're comparing social media problematic use versus gaming, video playing online, video addictive behavior, we know that anxiety, ADHD, depression, OCD-like behaviors contribute to both types of behavior, but actually ADHD has a stronger effect than these other disease conditions in terms of driving social media excessive problematic use than it does driving, so that the impact of ADHD rises above these other anxiety, depression, and OCD factors when we're talking about social media use versus gaming behavior. And also, and if we're just comparing directly, the role of ADHD has a stronger impact on whether you're going to be a social media abuser, if we're going to use that term, versus a gaming abuser or addict. So some of the trying to look at why this connection is pretty consistently found looks at what's going on. And clearly, adolescence is the time most commonly people develop a social media use problem. It's substantially less common in preteen years. It can certainly exist all across the age spectrum, but the older you go, the less likely. Also, the higher educated you are, the less likely you are to develop problematic social media use. And there is a gender bias. So unlike the problematic gaming, which is heavily skewed towards males, the problematic social media use is skewed towards females. And that is true also in the ADHD realm, where ADHD itself is skewed towards males, not females. I hope I just said that right. So males with ADHD are more likely than non-ADHD males to get into social media problematic use, but females with ADHD are, even to a larger extent, more likely than females without ADHD to run into social media problematic behavior. So the neuroscientists trying to look at this connection here say that adolescence is a time of, there's a strong drive towards socialization. So until early teenage years, our parents and our family are the primary social context and who we draw most of our, and these are overgeneralizations, but they are fairly robust and strong across cultures. We draw on our families for who we're connected to, who we listen to, who we're spending time with, and that switches to peer group during teenage years. And areas of brain involved in socialization are undergoing substantial change and growth during those times. Also, early adolescence, actually throughout adolescence, there's also the reward system seems to be undergoing substantial development. So things that are rewarding, exciting, giving you dopamine hits have a bigger impact at that age than at younger kids. Not that younger kids can't be motivated to do things. So the reward system is strongly coming online, and yet the cognitive higher frontal cortex regulatory, delayed gratification systems are not as strongly engaged. So this is in all adolescents going on, and many, but not all researchers would say the evidence is pretty strong that the adolescent in dealing with ADHD, those statements can be taken to an even higher level. So even more driven by immediate reward, even more concerned about social connections and fitting in. And yet at the same time, a number of extensive body of research, again, these are averages and overgeneralizations, but kids with ADHD are more likely to be rejected by their peers. They're more likely to make social mistakes, either blurting things out, cutting people off, or saying things overly candid that hurt people or intrude on their space. So kids with ADHD and adolescents are faced with even stronger feelings of already being rejected socially, and yet a strong drive to be connecting socially. So some surveys have indicated that kids with ADHD actually have a preference for interacting on the internet rather than face-to-face with individuals. So this may be part, again, driving why ADHD may be driving social media tendency to abuse or problematic behavior. So others, again, so people with ADHD on measures of loneliness in childhood, adolescence rate higher, social rejection higher. So in some ways we could see social media as a way to self-medicate. You can't get connections in your classmates, you may try to get it online. And these theories are not mutually exclusive. Another one is that people with ADHD find it harder to resist distractions, and particularly with cell phones being ubiquitous, you are constantly being pinged, reminded. And again, that's not just a reminder of something exciting, it's a social connection, something exciting. So again, that's the double whammy in these teenage years of it's attractive because it's connecting you to something, and it's attractive because it's rewarding. And the other aspect, and we talked about some of this with the gaming addictions, is that the modern social media is a much faster interaction. You can be texting 14, I mean, it's multitasking, it's faster, it's scrolling from one to one. So you are having external distractions coming up more quickly. You have internal distractions that you get to scroll onto something else, jump onto something else. So all of these ADHD factors may be contributing to problematic social media use. So looking at from the other direction, social media use driving ADHD symptoms, some of this is differing a little bit across the age span, but lots of studies have shown that the more hours you spend at 1 or 2 or 3, as you're still looking what's happening in early childhood years, there's a good correlation between the amount of time you're spending in front of a screen, and you may question at one whether that's social media or not, but so slower cognitive development, poorer effortful control, poorer verbal development and communication skills, poorer self-regulation of emotions, and less pro-social interactions at, again, all this within an early age. And if we look at later age groups, again, a correlation between absolute amount of time and ability to pay attention. A number of executive function skills seem poor, correlated with the amount of time you've spent in front of a screen. Poor language development, again, decreased happiness and increased loneliness the more time you're spending in front of these screens. Now, some of these, again, are going to be merely correlations rather than causation. So some studies which have tried to pull out confounding factors find, again, that the connection is much stronger with problematic social media use rather than just absolute screen time, even though at the absolute level, so I'll cite one study, it looked at kids at ages 2, 4, 6, how much screen time they were spending. If you just measured it directly, kids spending more screen time were much more likely than their peers at age 8 or 10 to have an ADHD diagnosis. But if you corrected for the mom's educational degree of how far she got in school, if you correct for whether the mom was smoking during pregnancy or using alcohol during pregnancy, if you correct for was the child born prematurely or not, if you correct for gender, then there was no correlation between how much time they were spending on front of screens and whether or not they had ADHD. So these host of other factors, which may again be driving both screen time and the development of ADHD, may be confounding, confusing, and again, it makes it really hard to sort out causality or whether it's, again, really the screen time causing this or whether they were spending more time in front of the screen because mom was neglectful or distracted or frustrated or depressed. Again, a whole host of other things that, again, correlate with each other. So that's about where I will stop with sort of the problem or the difficulty sorting out causality. I'd say regardless of how strong it is that ADHD is driving problematic use or problematic use is driving ADHD, there's clearly a reinforcing feedback loop problem. So again, if you are having problems in this area, it does make sense to try to assess whether you're having a problem, and two, do something about it. So one of the most standard treatments for anything with ADHD is to apply stimulant medications because that helps reduce driving accidents. It helps reduce absenteeism at work. It helps reduce suicide. It helps reduce a whole host of negative outcomes with ADHD. To my knowledge, I have not found a single study yet looking at whether medications such as the stimulants actually help someone regulate themselves more and pull back or withdraw from excess social media problematic behavior. It makes sense, but no proven data there, unlike most of the other areas we've talked about. Since it seems that one of the periods of crucial developmental years are the preteen years when someone may be developing patterns or habits that lead to or contribute to further attention, concentration, hyperactivity, impulsivity problems down the road, we know that parenting behaviors have a substantial role in the development both of ADHD symptoms and problematic social media use. So many kids with ADHD have parents with ADHD, one or more parents. ADHD parents themselves are less able to control their own social media use, so they're less good role models for their kids, but there also is measurably, so one of the desirable styles is called an authoritative. So that's setting limits, being gentle but firm and saying this is reasonable for you to behave, do or not. And there is a over tendency of ADHD households to adopt either excessively lax and loose and no restrictions and anything can happen, or an authoritarian, not authoritative, but authoritarian, where it's excessively negative, excessively rigid, excessively controlling. And again, either extreme seems to be correlated with worse ADHD symptoms down the line and more extensive problematic social media use. So the approach is again, given that some part of the problematic online social media use is not having good enough social skills in the real world, is teaching kids and adults better social skills. And the evidence so far that I will really briefly summarize is that teaching social skills, particularly to kids, seems far more effective if you're doing it live in a recreational group, in a happy, supportive, interactional group, rather than just sitting them down and trying to teach them these skills. Point number 4 is, again, we talked about people with ADHD on social media use are far more likely to be texting, connecting with people late at night. So, and we also know that sleep deprivation then contributes to the severity of ADHD symptoms. So, and that there are probably biological reasons people with ADHD are more likely to want to stay up late at night or have more trouble controlling it. I would resort to sort of behavioral and technological. Use apps that lock yourself out of your app after a certain time at night. Remember to put your phone in a different room than the one you're sleeping in, so you're not tempted as you're going off to bed to check 3 more updates on people's accounts or some 2 more texts or something like that. And an important point to emphasize here is that we spend so much time focusing on whether people are getting enough sleep, and it's every bit as important to get the same consistent hours of sleep. So if you're used to sleeping 8 hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., but you stay up 4 hours late and try to sleep from 2 to 10 a.m., those hours of sleep are not as restorative, not as refreshing, probably not as useful for physiologically cleaning the garbage out of your brain. So getting the same and sufficient sleep is important. There's a little bit of work trying to look at the benefits of green time versus screen time. So one of the things that's shocking is the average shows that young people are spending more hours a day on the screen than they are spending hours a week outside. So less than 7 hours a week on average outside in green time, more than 7-8 hours a day in front of a screen. And there's some evidence that, again, that green time can mitigate some of the effects of ADHD and may specifically help with mitigating some of the effects of excessive screen time. There's one study, again, this is not particularly ADHD individuals, but just looking at a classroom. I'm not remembering what, I think it was 5th grade, but it may be off on that. Spending a week at an outdoor retreat center versus their kids who were in an alternate class who didn't get to go on the trip, spending, and I think that they were using social media screen time about 5 hours a day, compared to, again, getting a break from it. And a number of measures of ability to read social interactions and emotional intelligence seem to be improved after just a week of being away from their screens. Whether that was because the kids were forced to be interacting live more hours a day, or whether it was the absence of the screen, or whether it was actually being outdoors and doing it, it's hard to know or decipher. I would think that all are having some effect. And then the other sort of counter to green time is just being more physically active. Most of the time people are doing social media, and yes, I've seen people walking and fixated on their phone, but most of the time people are fairly sedentary, and we know that physical activity is helpful for ADHD and for lessening ADHD symptoms. So we certainly need more research on this, but even more research, it's going to be hard to ever eliminate all the confounding variables, and we're not going to get to do the ideal social experiment. So let's take 115-year-olds who've never been on social media and let them go wild on it starting at this point, compared to a control group who still abstains from it, and seeing what extent of ADHD symptoms, or doing that starting with a group of ADHD kids and looking at how they may use social media differently. we can't control all the variables. That doesn't mean we won't learn more, but I will stop there. And I see there's at least one question from Dennis. Hi, Dennis. Yeah, so Dennis was just remarking that it's disturbing how much screen time I have in a week between gaming, reading, computer use, etc. I find it alarming. I am a oddball here, even for my ancient peer group. My phone, which is right here, stays right here next to the computer when I'm not. I mean, I'll occasionally going on a trip, but if I'm going to the store, if I'm walking outside, I don't take my phone with me. And when I'm not in the front of the computer, I'm not with the phone either. So when I'm eating and doing other things, I'll come back and check. But so I have a weird perspective that even compared to my husband or other who's older, but spending much more time plugged in, it's scary how pervasive these tools are. And again, they're not all bad. They're not all evil. They can certainly foster some degree of social connection. They can certainly make a whole host of other activities and interactions more efficient, more extensive, more fulfilling. But, and the important variable I have not addressed here, I think I mentioned it with the gaming, is that you're using them, you're clicking, they want them to be sticky. They want you to keep using them. And I think people with ADHD are even more likely than the average person to be trapped by some of those reinforcements that they are implanting at a non-conscious level into these tools. So I am not seeing any more questions coming up. Next week's topic is going to be ADHD and testosterone. Okay, I see something new from Dan. So Dan's commenting that he's not saying capitalist society is bad at all, but it's so bad for people with ADHD. And I'd say there are certainly other systems that are bad for people with ADHD, but a more collectivist, more focused on human welfare than on making money certainly does disadvantage people who go off track frequently. And Christopher has something to add. So Christopher says, we live in a marketplace that prizes gaming our attention, making attempts to self-regulate very difficult. Yeah, I wasn't even on social media until some of the last third of my book, Recognizing Adult ADHD, What Donald Trump Can Teach Us. So I say my book has three halves. First half was using ADHD to explain Donald Trump's behavior, which I argue makes absolutely no sense if you don't understand the ADHD component. Second half was using Trump because he was in everyone's face and they could see examples, even if he's toxic or agitates you, or if you love him. He's a beautiful example of what adult ADHD at a severe level looks like, and lots of people who are still not aware of ADHD could use that and learn about ADHD in themselves, their neighbors, and others. And then the third half of the book was how our whole society is moving in a more and more ADHD way, because there are feedback loops that, like social media, like sleep deprivation, like changes in exercise and diet, that the more you engage in these behaviors, the more fractured your attention concentration, more impulsive you become, which makes you indulge more in these very same behaviors that aren't good for you. So I wasn't even on social media at all until I wrote my book and I was trying to promote the book. So I actually had to get on social media to tell people to reduce their social media, which certainly has an irony to it. So stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll be back next week.